Thank you for tuning in. Today we will show you, start to finish, how to make naturally leavened sourdough bread. I will use my starter, but you may not have a starter to use at home. Do not worry. First, you can make one on your own, and there are plenty of YouTube videos to show you how. However, and better yet, you can have some of mine. The first 100 viewers who sign up on our website below will have the opportunity to get some of my starter for free simply by paying the shipping cost. Now let's get started. All good sourdough bread is made from a really good, well-seasoned sourdough starter. In my case, this is the starter. This has been made probably about 10 years ago from the wine grapes of Sangfrau Winery in St. Helena, California. And it's really just getting the yeast off of those grapes into the starter and fermented then for many days to form the starter. This has been going for many years, and I feed this every day. And we're about to make a batch of bread today with the starter. This, as you can see, is full of holes and is the condition of the starter that you want to see before you actually start baking with it. It needs to be very light, very bubbly, and has a great aroma. Not too sour, but just sour enough. So I will have a separate video on how to maintain your starter and manage your starter. But for now, this was fed last night before I went to bed. So it's now roughly 9 o'clock in the morning. And so it has been fermenting for about 11 hours. My starter typically can be used between anywhere from as early as 6 hours from when you feed it to up to 18 hours when you feed it, and then it really needs to be refreshed before you can use it. So you have to have an active starter before you can actually make your bread. Okay, to start the bread, I actually mix it in a Hausler mixer. That's the brand. This is the mixer. I also have a very accurate scale to measure out the ingredients. Everything in bread baking is done by weight, not by volume. So you need a very good scale. So what we will do is we will lift this up and we will measure out our ingredients into our pot, and then we will mix it without the flour. So it really is just going to be the sourdough starter. Let me get a closer view of the sourdough starter so you can see kind of how it is bubbly and its condition. Like that. So we will use 20% sourdough starter. We will use 100% flour, and I use 80% water in my bread, which is a fairly high hydration level for sourdough bread, but it yields a very moist bread that lasts a long time in the refrigerator. So let's get started. So step one, we will tar our scale. What that means is to set it to 0 with your container. So I typically use this plastic container on top of my scale, and then it's just a matter of hitting the tar button, which will then set the weight to 0. And then I can put my ingredients in here, and then I will transfer it into the bowl. I always start with the wet ingredient, and let's talk briefly about baker's percentages. It's fairly simple. The flour is 100% always in a baker's formula. So in this case, I'm going to use 2,000 grams of organic flour. So I use an 80% hydration recipe, which means that the water is 80% of that 100% of flour. So there's 2,000 grams of flour, and 80% of that is 1,600 grams of water. And then for my starter, I will use 20% or 400 grams of starter. And then the salt, which is the only other ingredient, which will come later, that's 2% or 40 grams of salt. And that's the recipe. Okay, so I have my water ready to go. Now let's talk about temperature. Everything in chemistry is sensitive to the temperature. Higher the temperature, the faster things happen. The lower the temperature, the slower things happen. With bread baking, typically you want to be between 75 and 80 degrees as your dough temp. It's called a desired DDT, or desired dough temperature. So I'm setting it to 80 degrees right now, and you can see I actually use this Taylor stick thermometer, which I like a lot because it's very accurate, it's very quick, and can be used to test anything in terms of temperature, meat, water, anything. Anyway, so this is at 80 degrees. Now I have only put in here 1,500 grams of water, not 1,600. The last 100 grams I hold back to put in while I'm mixing in. So I put in the starter, 400 grams, and notice that it floats in the water. That's what you want to see. You want to have enough air bubbles and lightness in your starter that when you put it in water, it floats. If it sinks to the bottom, it means the starter is not fully developed or overdeveloped. So it's too dense and it needs to get proper yeast going so it's ready to grow basically once you give it more food, which is the flour to come. Now let's talk about flour. I use organic flour from Central Milling here in Northern California. They'll ship around the country, although during this crisis I don't think they're shipping on a retail level at this point. This is their white organic medium rye flour. I put in 15% to 20% rye flour and the rest with organic unbleached white flour that they refer to as ABC flour, Artisan Baker's Craft flour. Here is the Artisan Baker's Craft flour. Notice there's a plus next to the name, and that is because this has a little bit of malted barley flour in it, so that it allows the crust to caramelize a little bit better, and I like that version. You can get this either with that or without that at your pleasure. Okay, so now I've put in 2,000 grams of total flour, 20%, 15% rye flour, 85% ABC flour, in the mixer with my sourdough starter and water, and we'll mix it. So now we're mixing. Now you can mix your bread by hand, you can mix it in anything. Quite frankly, this is a fairly fancy mixer, but you do not have to have a fancy mixer. You really are simply trying to incorporate the water and the flour completely, and then we're going to stop. We're not going to overmix it, and we're not going to knead the bread. This is in effect a non-kneading process, because sourdough starter itself, with the acids in the starter, will develop the gluten, and you don't need to do an extensive amount of kneading. So as you can see already, this is getting fairly well incorporated. And this is about all I'm going to do at this point. Let's take a look. It stops, and you get the idea. A little bit sticks to the side, but it's basically fully incorporated. Now we're going to let that rest for 30 minutes, what's called an autolyse. And it's called an autolyse because I have not put the salt in yet. This is simply just sourdough starter, water, and flour. And it sits for 30 minutes, and it helps develop the gluten, and then we'll come back and we'll add the salt, and then we will also add a little bit more water. Now let's talk about feeding the starter. I've just used as much starter as I need for the sourdough recipe, and I have this amount left over. I'm going to feed it so that I can use it tomorrow. How do I feed it? Okay, so I have my scale is set to 0, right? I will put this on there, and then, like I said, I will tar it, so this goes to 0. Now what I will do is add 300 grams of flour and 300 grams of water, equal parts flour and water, to feed the starter, and let that sit for another 12 hours. There, so now I've mixed the sourdough starter with the added flour, added water, and see how dense it is? It's now almost like that bread dough, although this is what you call 100% hydrated starter, because I used equal amounts by weight of water and flour. Now let me make a comment that there are different flavor profiles you get by your starter ratios. So in many cases, people like a drier starter is down as low as 65% hydration. So you would put in, for example, 100 grams of flour and 65 grams of water in the starter, and make a much drier starter. And that creates a different type of yeast growth that you get compared to what's referred to as a liquid starter, which is what I'm making, which is equal parts water and equal part flour. Okay, now let's measure out the salt. The starter and the flour and the water are all combined, and we're going through the autolyse right now, so we have 30 minutes to kill. So while I do that, I always measure out the salt and leave it right next to the mixer because on occasion, it's only happened once for me, but it can happen very easily, you forget to put the salt in, and then the bread is ruined. So the formula is 2% salt. Again, with Baker's formula, that 2% refers to the flour as a reference point. So a flour is 100%. So the flour was 2,000 grams, so 2% of 2,000 grams is 40. I always use grams, it's way easier than using imperial. So we'll do 40 grams of salt, and this will go in after the autolyse is done, and we will mix it with a little bit more water, 100 grams more water I reserved out, and then that will be our final dough. Now, the other thing I use is actually, this is actually in a Kirkland container, but actually Central Milling also sells sea salt, so I use sea salt. Okay, one thing we'll need to do is we'll need to get our bulk proofing container set and ready to go once our dough has been salted. So this is a plastic tub that I own. I'd recommend getting some either plastic or something that's coverable. I prefer something rectangular so I can fold the bread easily. And what I do is I just lightly coat the pan with a canola cooking spray so that when the bread is in here, it's easy to flip. And you'll see in a minute once we start doing that why that's important. Okay, our autolyse is now complete. It's been 30 minutes since we mixed the sourdough, and it's firmed up a little bit in the pan. What we're going to now do is add the salt and just a little bit more water. The way I do it is I put the salt in, because this is a fairly complete mixer and it does a really good job of mixing up. And I will turn this on, and we're only going to run this mixer until the salt is fully incorporated, adding just a little bit more water through the slot. Probably about 2 minutes. So we'll let it go, and we'll add a little bit more water, not a whole lot, just enough to keep the dough from sliding up the dough hook, getting a nice mix. Keeping my hands on the lid because it makes a noise if I don't for the audio. But there you can see it mixing really well. And we'll just put a little more. You don't need a whole lot of water after this. If you're doing this by hand, you probably wouldn't need any water, quite frankly, because you can just fold the salt in by hand. Or if you're mixing it in a KitchenAid mixer, same kind of thing, you can put in a little bit more if you need it. Again, I err on the side of more hydration on my bread, more water, only because it really stays moist after it's been baked. It's a little harder to handle. It sticks to your hand, which you'll see later when we're shaping the bread, but it makes for a very flavorful, rich, long-lasting sourdough. Okay, so that's been a minute and a half. We're going to go just a little bit longer and make sure everything is completely incorporated. So this is in effect a no knead. We're not doing a whole lot of kneading here. We're just mixing in the salt. Okay, so now we're going to remove the dough from the mixer. And you can see it comes right off, and the gluten's already been somewhat developed. It's sliding right off the dough hook just fine. Up we go. We're gonna remove the bowl and get ready to put it in our bulk fermentation container. Okay, now we're ready to take the mixed bulk dough and put it into our bulk storage container. And we'll use a couple of critical tools that every baker I'm sure already knows about, but we have our flexible plastic scraper, and we have our more stiff dough scraper for the counter. So I typically flip this over and basically scrape it right out of the mixing bowl. Again, you can do it any way you want. It's a little sticky because, like I said, it's a very wet dough. So we scrape it out thusly. Okay, then once I get it out, I get my hands a little wet in the kitchen sink behind me here, just so the dough doesn't stick to me, and I give it some flipping just to get it sort of mixed up, a little smoother, because I'm going to have to lift it and put it in my bulk container over here. So I typically like to sort of fold it a bit like this. You'll see it kind of firm up a little bit, and then you just go all quickly and put it. See, it does stick to your hands a bit because it's very moist. So we take the rest of it, and there you go. So now it's in your bulk container. We'll put the lid on that, and that will ferment for 4 hours in the bulk container. And we don't knead it. The kneading will be every half hour. We will fold this dough on 4 different sides. We'll fold it this way, we'll fold it this way, we'll fold it this way, and then we'll fold it that way every half hour. And that's all the kneading you're going to need to do. Okay, this will be our first fold. So we have mixed the dough. We've auto-leased it for 30 minutes. We've then put on the counter, flipped it around a couple times. We put it into the bulk fermentation bin here, and now it's been sitting there for half an hour. So it's still very dense, as you can see. It's very sticky. So we need to fold this every half an hour. This is the first fold, and you'll see the differences. So as you fold it, you do 2 things. You're kneading it when you fold it, in effect, and you're also testing to see what condition the dough is in. And you'll notice as we fold further and further into the process that this will double in volume, and it'll get much more fluffier before we're ready to divide it up and put it into our final proofing baskets. So to do our first fold, what we do is we get our hands wet, because this is a very sticky dough, so it's much easier if your hands are soaking wet. So I often will do this next to the sink, but my camera can't get over here very easily, so I will just reach over. So my hands are soaking wet, and I pull up and I pull over. See how stringy it is, and it's the gluten's starting to develop. Fold it like that. See, I fold it half again. I'm going sideways, up, stretch it really good, and then just, whoops, flip it right on top of itself. All the way around, up, over, and down. There you go. All right, that's it. So that's all the kneading you need to do. You'll do that every half hour until this is ready to put in the final basket. Okay, this is fold number 2. So this has been processed, put in here, folded once after 30 minutes. It's now been an hour. It's a little bit lighter. It's a little shinier. So the gluten's been a little more developed, you can see. Again, we get our hands wet, which I will do here over at the sink. And then we grab the corner, we pick it up, and we come around. We'll do it on this angle so you can see better. Pick it up, and come around. So the point of this is we're actually folding the bread on top of itself so that we stretch out the gluten and we cause tension to develop within the gluten strand. So we're creating like a balloon here. This is a little tighter. Actually, the gluten is developing nicely in this. There you go. There you go. Fold it 4 times. Wait another half. Okay, this is now fold number 3. This has been going for quite some time. Look at the gluten development. See how it's thick and stretchy right there? That's actually all the gluten developing just perfectly. Nice and shiny, but still fairly dense. There's not a whole lot of holes that you see on the bottom. So this clearly has more time to go. So I will wet my hands so that I don't get really sticky. Reach in, and again, pull up and fold. Pull up and fold over. Pull up and fold. Pull up and fold. There we go. Much better. Much more gluten development. Look how tight that is. It's actually looking really good, but it still needs a bunch more time. Hey there, fellow YouTubers. Now I'm going to talk about what happens when the bulk fermentation process has been completed, and we're going to make and shape these things into boules, into rounds. So as you can see from my bulk container, this is completely puffed up, and it has doubled in volume, maybe a little more than double in volume. I'm going to set that aside. And the utensils we're going to use to do this are obviously the dough itself. We have our scale because we're going to measure out the amount of dough. This was 2,500 grams of flour. It was almost 2,000 grams of water and about 500 grams of sourdough starter. So many kilos of dough right here. So I'm going to make 6 loaves of bread out of this. So step number 1 is I just flip it up, and I use a plastic flexible scraper because I want to be able to get the dough out of my bulk container. So I'm scraping it off the back gently, and notice all the bubbles. And it sticks a little bit because I use a very high hydration recipe. So this flour, this bread, is what you would consider to be a high hydration, meaning there's a lot of water in it, so it's tacky and sticky. But it also means it develops great flavor and it stays moist after it's done. So we get it out of the fermentation tub, and there you go. There is your bulk dough, and we have our scale set to grams. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to use our bread scraper. This is a stiff regular bread scraping knife to actually separate out the dough and make sure that we then make it into a quick boule, weigh it out, and then set it aside. And we're going to let it rest after we do that. So we just go in, and I'm just guessing right now how much 850 grams would be. You come in, you roll it, pick it up. That's 813 grams on that roll. So I set that aside. That's about what I want. Do another one. So you're cutting it, then you're flipping it, and ideally you're using the friction on the counter to create the round. So you can shove the bread around. Now this is a little bit less than that. There's 867, so I just add a little bit more. Scrape it, set it aside. Do it again, cut it, fold it, round it, and then you can use the counter to shape it into a boule. Notice how it doesn't, it's not super tacky. In part, that's because of the gluten's been fully developed on the bread. There we go at 839. Another loaf. We'll do one more. Flip it, flip again, shape. You got to move quickly so it doesn't stick to the scraper. Pick it up. I'm a little light this time. I've been consistently light. That's about 840. Okay. That means this guy is going to end up with 2 more loaves. Flip this guy over. That's a little light. There we go, 832. That leaves us with the last piece. We flip it. We shove it around, make sure it's in a boule. This is going to be a little heavier. Yeah, that's 973. So that I'm going to allocate out a little bit because that's a little too heavy. I'm trying to make them all roughly the same size. There we go. So there is our unshaped bread dough divided into 6 loaves. Okay, now once we have the bulk dough divided out into our loaf shapes, how do we make a boule and put it in the basket for what we refer to as the final proof? I use these individual cloth lined baskets for my boules. And that's what we're going to do. The other thing I want to point out to you is that thanks to Steve Sullivan of Acme Bakery, I use his formula for the flour that is used for dusting, and that this is 50% white rice flour and 50% regular flour. And the reason for it, the rice flour, is it doesn't have any gluten in it, which makes it less sticky, so it doesn't stick to the baskets. So this is the technique. So in order to handle this dough, it's fairly sticky. So what I like to form a loaf using wet hands and a wet dough scrape. So it's off camera, but I'm going to go over to the sink and I'm going to wet my hands and I'm going to clean off the scrape and make sure it's just slightly moist. It's not soaking wet, just slightly moist. So my hands are now wet. Typically what I do with wet hands, see, it doesn't stick that much. See how light and fluffy this is? It's great dough. It's ready to go. You have to go under so you can grab it. You go very quickly under, stretch it, flip it, left, go right, left, like that. Come right under behind it. Make sure you get all of the dough. Come up around, flip it down, around, push. And then again, use the counter to help shape the dough. It's just the friction of the counter and the gluten on the bread that's now formed a boule. Okay, so now what I would do is I have, by the way, a little screen that I use to dole out the flour. I just put a little bit of rice flour on my basket so it doesn't stick in the basket. Now this is the tricky part, is you go fairly quickly. You get under, flip, put it in upside down, and then I immediately take my fingers and tighten up the boule. So I want to make sure that in the basket, the ball that I'm putting in here is as tightly wound as I can make it within reason. So this is a nice wet dough, so it sticks to itself nicely. And you just stretch it up a little bit, and I just create a little more tension on the dough. There we go. Then, because I'm going to cover this and let it do the fermentation, I'm going to put a little more rice flour on the top so nothing's going to stick to it when I'm done. Let me show you one more time. So I wet my hands, I wet my dough scraper, I come back in, I'll do this guy right here, put it in the center. I like to flatten it just a little bit. Don't flatten it like a pancake. Get it so I can reach under it, flip, over, round, go behind, get a nice air bubble right there. And then you're creating tension like that. And you want to press down on the edge of the dough so that it seals it, right? Like that. You get a nice round, pick a nice basket. So you can do this very quickly. You don't need to lollygag around. Scoop it up, flip it over, get it nice and tight. See, I'm going on opposite sides and it sticks to itself right away. Stretch, just really pull it in tight. You want like a soccer ball. You want this thing super inflated with air, and as that poofs up, it'll get nice oven spring. And we do the cookie duster. That's it. That's what you're ready for the final proof. Okay, one more time on, I've made a couple of loaves already. I'm going to show you one more time how to do this. So you press it down a little bit. I come under the front so I get my fingers under there, grab it, stretch it towards me, flip it over, go left, go right, and then flip it on top of itself. So you're creating like bubble gum. You're trying to take this and just stretch it out and then create a ball. And then you shape it on the granite counter or wooden counter, whatever you have. You get a nice basket. You don't have a basket, you can use a cloth lined bowl of any kind. Put it in there and then create extra tension. So I created some tension when I flipped it all over. I'm creating even more tension. If you look, I'm grabbing the edge and I'm pulling it over itself. Nice little bubble over there. One more time, over, and then it sticks to itself. You just spread it out so it grabs onto itself like that. And then we put a little light dusting on top, so when I put a cloth on it, as it's proofing, it won't stick. Okay, so now we have shaped all 6 loaves. We've put them in their baskets. We've dusted them off with the 50% rice flour and regular flour, and they're ready to do the final fermentation in their basket. Now, I only have 2 cast iron pots to cook these in my oven at home at a time, so that means I can cook 1 batch, 2 batches, 3 batches. It takes 40 minutes to cook the bread. So if I start with this batch, that means this is going to ferment for 40 more minutes longer than this one. And then this one is going to be 80 minutes longer than both of these. That ends up making the last 2 loaves over ferment, because I generally go about 3 hours before I start baking once I'm in this final fermentation. What's the answer? Simple. You take 2 of these baskets and put them in the refrigerator. And I'll leave them in there for about an hour while these guys are fermenting. Then I'll bring them back out, so it will retard their fermentation a bit so that basically they'll all be equally fermented by the time I put them in the oven. Okay, let's talk about how I bake the bread. I used a lodgepole Dutch oven, 2 of them, which are cast iron, and you can see that right there. Those are the Dutch ovens. And the nice thing about these Dutch ovens is that they have a lid that comes off that is narrow and does not have a handle on top of the lid. So basically you can flip them upside down and put the bread on the top. What would have been the lid becomes the bottom, and then the rest of the pan comes over the bread. Let me show you the oven configuration. I simply just have a large stone on the bottom of my oven, which is actually a kiln shelf, bigger and thicker than a pizza stone, but basically just to hold the heat in the oven. Most of the heat is actually held by the cast iron pots. Okay, it has now been 2.5 hours, and we've checked on our bread. There it is. And it looks like it is ready for baking. With the nice bubbles in through here. Leave a little indent, still comes back just a little bit. So we will get ready to bake. Okay, we are ready to bake our first loaf of bread. I have these oven mitts that I've purchased that are protected. So I'm going to reach down and just pull out the thin lid of those Lodge cast iron pots, one at a time. First one, pull out. That's 450 degrees. Been sitting there for an hour to get up to temp. You hold your hand, you flip it over, and it comes out of the basket. You need to buy a scoring knife like this, which I will put on the link on the web page. You scrape off a little bit of your rice flour, and then you score it. You want to do this quickly and deeply, at an angle. Score once, score twice. Actually, sometimes I'll do it again to get a little deeper. And then you simply put it in the oven, right like that, with the lid on it. Okay, whoop, nice and hot. We'll do that one more time with this loaf. Flip over, nice and hot. Scrape off excess flour. You don't have to do this, but I don't like the rice flour on there. When I'm done, score, and put back in the oven. A little bit of smoke on the oven, mainly because I put some oil on it to season it. Okay, now that the bread is baked for 20 minutes with the lid on, you will see my technique for taking the lid off, and I call it the big reveal because you will see the bread and its oven spring. There you go. And I put the lid on the bottom to keep it in there for the next loaf. Like that. That's all there is to it. And we wait another 20 minutes and then it will be done. Okay, now the bread has been in there for 40 minutes, and I will find my mitts and we will take the finished bread out of the oven. And I've got it zoomed in right at the oven so you can see the bread. Look at that, right on top. There we go. Flip that out, leave that in there for the next bake. That in there. Voila. There we have a nicely baked loaf of sourdough. Okay, so here are 4 of the loaves after they've been baking. Let me zoom in. We can get some nice shots of the caramelized crust that you see and the scoring. This one has lines on it because my couche that I put it in actually has the bamboo on it, so it picks up with the lines on the bread. And notice how the When we scored the bread, it opened it up and allowed the bread to rise up into the center and split open like that. That actually is a critical sign that your yeast is very active and that you've fermented the bread for the proper amount. There you go. The other two are still in the oven, and we have 6 loaves of sourdough bread.